We heard about technology and the development of technology and the time periods and the vast improvements that can happen when dedicated research and investment is poured into this. The initiative I work for is looking at the other part of that equation, which is human behavior. And in many ways, the governance, the human decision-making process, is actually the hardest part of this whole equation. So I'll say a few words about the initiative because it's relevant to how carbon dioxide removal might be understood by society and might be governed under existing UNFCCC frameworks. So our initiative is very small, and we're basically trying to take the research and the knowledge that is building up in the scientific community, go out into the world and speak with policymakers in national governments, in the UN system, here in the bank, in civil society groups. We even did a half-day briefing at the Vatican 2 years ago, because there are very profound ethical questions about some of these technologies. And when we have these briefings, it's very, very clear to us that there's a low level of knowledge among senior policymakers, not just about these technologies, which is to be expected, they're new, but really on the gravity and the urgency of the climate crisis. And if one doesn't understand that, then no one will understand, why are you talking about these new technologies? Why do we need to discuss this? Why are they being developed? So as I said earlier, we're now in the era of no risk-free options. We are headed towards 4C by the end of the century. That's a devastating number. And so when we go to these policymakers and start talking about what scientists are developing, it is always in the context of that larger risk framework. In other words, business as usual, we're heading over 3, even if all of Paris is implemented, which it's not. More likely 4+. On the other hand, there are a suite of new technologies generally grouped into 2 different baskets. One, carbon dioxide removal, which is what we're focusing on here today. The other, solar radiation modification, or what has been known as solar geoengineering. And the risks there are both known and unknown. And to Dave's point, I love the Department of Unintended Consequences. That is absolutely true. Because some of these technologies may not have consequences that we can measure for decades to come. And so decision makers, whether they're head of a large civil society group, whether they're the World Bank, whether the UN Secretary General, they have to look at these choices in this risk management framework. The risks of what we're currently doing versus the risks known and unknown, and not just scientific risks, but very importantly, political risks, security risks, human rights risks, ethical concerns, and make some choices in that whole smorgasbord of options. Last year, about exactly a year ago, the IPCC released the 1.5 degree report that really landed with a thud on policymakers' desks. It was, to my mind, the clearest articulation in an IPCC report in quite some time. Among the other findings was this statement: there are no pathways to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees or below without the use of large-scale carbon dioxide removal, CDR. What is large scale? The IPCC was talking about anywhere from 100 to 1,000 gigatons by the end of this century. So if you quickly do the math, that's about 25 times annual global emissions today. 25 times 40. Has to be sucked out from the atmosphere and safely stored somewhere or used in products. We collectively, society, the world, are nowhere near that. That is a massive, unprecedented undertaking. And to make that process as effective, equitable, and safe as possible, we need to make sure that these types of CDR are governed. And governance can mean not only the regulatory aspect, it can also mean governance that can help scale those technologies, those CDR approaches that society has agreed are beneficial and is willing to accept. So we have this massive challenge of sucking out carbon from the atmosphere, in addition to turning off the faucet in the bathtub. Remember that picture. The most effective thing to do, turn off the faucet. But now we need to also drain the bathtub, according to the IPCC. That new conception of what we need to do is just beginning to seep into policymakers' minds. They're just beginning to grapple with, what does that really mean? We've had discussions with a number of governments that weren't really aware of this new IPCC finding. The UNFCCC has not one staff person, dedicated to looking at the issue of CDR and its governance under the UNFCCC framework. So we've been doing a lot of running around the world and talking to policymakers, not to give them answers, but to lay forward the questions. How will this be done? Who makes the decision? Is it equitable? How do we measure it? Everything from methodology to liability and everything in between. Because removals have been in the UNFCCC framework from the beginning. It's not a new concept. What is new is this scale, this unbelievably huge scale that in and of itself raises additional governance questions. Now, my colleague here said, when there are challenges, there are opportunities. And that's also true with CDR. And there are some entrepreneurial groups who are using technologies like blockchain, people looking at different mechanisms on a small scale for CDR. And one could see, if the policy incentives were correct, that this represents a $1 trillion opportunity. Sucking carbon out of the air could potentially be a huge new market. And that's where governance comes in. Governance could provide subsidies, for example, or accelerated depreciation, or other incentives for people to take on that challenge. But thus far, there is no policy that covers the gamut of these needs. And so we are meeting with governments, we're meeting with the UNFCCC, their subsidiary bodies, saying, you have this new challenge now. We don't have the answer. That's for you to decide. But you need to look at it now. And it's extremely challenging because the climate regime, as it is extremely challenging. And in the last UNFCCC COP, just getting the Paris rulebook agreed is a huge challenge. And many governments have told us, wow, this is huge. This would have huge impacts on our land, our agriculture, our human rights, human habitation. We don't have the bandwidth to learn about this right now. We don't have the bandwidth to hire someone in our government to help us with policy making on these things. And so the educational training capacity building need is enormous. And I know a lot of what the World Bank has done for years and years falls into that realm. There's a huge need out there for training, for capacity building on how to grapple with the CDR challenge. At the Secretary General's Summit just about a month ago, 77 countries and about 100 cities around the world stepped forward and said they will go to net zero emissions by 2050. This is even accelerated beyond what's in the Paris Agreement. I would venture that at least half of these countries don't really understand that to get to net zero emissions in 2050, they will need to use large-scale CDR. But there is the math, and this represents a huge challenge and a huge opportunity, a challenge for governance, even more than the science, of making equitable, inclusive decisions on this new era in our climate change discourse.